You're listening to ABC Southern Queensland.
Belinda Sanders, good morning to you.
Good morning. Now, of course, if you are watching television, listening to the radio, reading newspapers, or looking at social media, it is hard to avoid the images of riots in the United States. They are a result of the death of George Floyd. Now, Mr Floyd was an unarmed black man who died on May the 25th in the Midwestern city of Minneapolis after a white police officer pressed a knee onto his neck for several minutes while restraining him. Mr Floyd repeatedly told the officer he could not breathe. The officer who held his knee on Mr Floyd's neck, Derek Chauvin, has been fired and charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter and is in custody in a state prison.
The other three officers on scene were fired the day after the incident but have not been charged. Now, the protests, as you know, have turned into riots, with businesses and public offices being looted and set on fire. More than half of the states on mainland America have called in the National Guard to back up police, and more than 45 million Americans are under overnight curfews. So what's it like living in that environment? Greg Smith is an Aussie who's been living in the US for around about 17 years now. He lives in the town of Bluebell, Pennsylvania, which is about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia on America's East Coast. And he joins me now where it's around about 6:30 in the evening. Greg, good morning.
Good morning, how are you doing?
Very, very well, mate. Thank you very much for having a chat to us. From the outside looking in, I think a lot of Australians are looking on at the riots happening across the US in disbelief, and others might be thinking that the same thing could happen here given the right set of circumstances. But what do outsiders need to know to really understand the situation and what's led to it over there?
I mean, it's been a little difficult. I think it started out, well-meaning with, obviously people expressing their opinion on what happened, but I think it's sort of got a little bit out of control with certain groups maybe that have come in to, I don't know, maybe stir the situation up or what have you. So it's been, I guess, perceived as a little disappointing in that respect that it has got to this level so quickly as well. And I think it's past the point now where people know why they're rioting. It's just the case of that it's happening, and it's like I said, it's disappointing.
But there is that feeling, though, that a lot of people involved now were perhaps, not really empathetic about the original reasons for the riots. They're just in it for the anarchy almost.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been reading stuff and seeing it on the news where, people have basically said that it's minimal that, or they don't even talk about what happened to George Floyd, and it's all about the anarchism that, that they're about, and the looting and just out of control behaviour, really.
So what is, from your point of view, obviously they have arrested the original officer. There are still two other officers that were at the scene at the time that George Floyd died. But it's not just about George, of course. There have been race issues that have been brought up in the United States for a while. But what's going to be potentially the thing that eases people down? Like, I've seen clips of some Americans saying stop, basketball players, even the George Floyd's father has now come out saying stop the riots.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say what's going to stop it. I've seen footage of police officers or sheriffs in, various states that have, taken off their tactical equipment and said, they wanted to march peacefully with, protesters, because you're talking a small group of people as to, what happened or instigated the whole process, but, a whole, I guess, police force, not just America-wide, worldwide, is being crucified for. So I think there's been stuff shown on like I said, on the news and so forth, where, where that has done, where, police officers have basically been talking to people, and, there was a clip I saw of a young male who was in tears, and, he was crying on a police officer's shoulder and stuff like that. So I think it just needs to be seen as peace, and the media need to show a little bit more of that, I think.
Is there a feeling, though, I mean, I guess having lived there for 17 years, did it take you long to appreciate the depth of feeling there in terms of the racial tension in America? I mean, this is an ongoing issue, and I guess the George Floyd death was really just the spark that sort of lit the fuse, so to speak. Did it take you long to sort of get your head around the depth of the problem there?
Yes and no. I mean, obviously, having white privilege born into, obviously a different race, it's difficult to understand, what people can go through, I suppose. But no, I mean, it's fairly well publicised, but I guess you don't really understand the extent of it until something like this does happen. It happens more often than people, I guess, think, which is the disappointing part, but you only hear of the big cases, which, I guess is the big issue.
Greg, is the rioting affecting you in your daily life, and how?
No, it's not affecting me in my daily life as such. I mean, Pennsylvania, obviously Philadelphia's been on the news where I am here. It's all major cities and even smaller cities that are being affected, but a lot of states are shut down due to the COVID virus as well. So it's, people have been locked up already anyway, so it's not as if people are not going out and doing their regular thing because of that. So not realistically, no. Just trying to, explain to my children what's going on and why is a little more challenging.
And how do you do that? I mean, how do you explain to young kids when they're seeing, or perhaps I'm not sure how much of the news you let your youngest kids watch, but how do you explain something like that to a child? That'd be a challenge.
It's definitely a challenge. I mean, the kids, the area that I come from, and like the way we're bringing our kids up is there's no racial identification of anybody. It's just your friends are your friends, and you just got to try and explain that there's some people that have different and varying opinions that may not be aligned with ours, and they just they can take things to extents that aren't necessary. But it is definitely challenging to try and explain it clearly to get them to understand. Like my youngest is 7 and he really doesn't know what's going on, but he sees what's going on, so it's definitely tough.
There's a feeling over here that a lot of it is, or now there's a lot of sort of anger directed at the American President Donald Trump and how he's sort of handling things, or perhaps his perceived failure to try and sort of calm the situation down. Is that the feeling that you're getting over there, sort of amongst Americans themselves?
I mean, as a general rule, yeah, I think no matter who the president would be, they're probably going to get blamed, because there's only so much that the person in power, I guess, can realistically do other than putting himself on the streets with people. A lot of the stuff over here is from state to state, so to speak. So, control is given to certain governors and so forth within the states. So it's difficult for him. He does not help himself sometimes with his social media and how he's perceived, which I think is the biggest problem. I think sometimes if he wasn't as outspoken on his own opinions, as opposed to possibly a country's opinions, that's what his challenge is too. He just needs to calm down there a little bit, I think.
Greg, here in Australia, there's been quite a lot of publicity about about a phone call that was leaked in relation to the US governors and how he's criticised them, saying that they need to come down hard and bring the National Guard, and the world is laughing. Is that being publicised in America as well?
It is. I mean, we've definitely seen it, and you'll have people that will agree with him, and you'll have people that will disagree with him, and it'll be split in, obviously various ways. Your non-violent people, your people that are for violence, your right wings, your left wings. It's going to be across the board, but it definitely has been broadcast. Yes.
I have to say, I don't think Australia is laughing. I don't think that's the right word.
Well, no, it's definitely not a laughing matter. When I say laughing, it's a tongue-in-cheek.
Oh, no,
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
that was what Donald Trump said.
Yeah, but more. The president was sort of suggesting that the world was laughing at the states that weren't coming down hard on the protesters, and I don't think. I think sort of most of the rest of the world probably tries to appreciate where it's going and have some empathy, I guess. I'm curious. Just lastly, I mean, for COVID-19 itself, you guys have been you've been in lockdown. You were saying since mid-March. What's the feeling there? Are those restrictions starting to ease in certain states, and what's the prediction as to when things might start to go back to normal for you and your family?
Yeah, it's been a state by state, up to the governors, I guess. Where I am, the county I am, we're in. We have our various counties, and the county that I'm in the county of Philadelphia, or Center City, Philadelphia, the last two, we're still in full lockdown and supposedly coming out of lockdown this coming Friday. And there's 3 stages that they bring us out of lockdown, where you can have, you can leave. Businesses can reopen and so forth at certain levels with, certain amount of occupants and so forth. And we have other counties, say 100 miles away, that may be going into their final phase of being able to open at basically a normal rate. But I think a lot of this is going to take quite some time, and, the economies felt it very harshly. So who will reopen and so forth too? So I guess I'm not sure what the normal is going to be after all this.
Indeed, and these riots have just thrown that further into chaos, I guess, in terms of store openings and what can open and when it's safe to go back into Philadelphia itself. I guess the jury's still out.
Exactly. I think a lot of these businesses watching the news were preparing to reopen this coming Friday, June the 5th, and now they have smashed windows. They have no stock inside due to the looting. So, while they're ramping up to reopen and possibly, get the economy back and rolling, I guess it's up in the air now as to whether that will happen or not. They may not have the stock. They may not have the staff, so to speak.
Indeed. Interesting times. Greg, I appreciate you taking the time for a chat and giving us your perspective. Thank you so much for that.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. All the best. Greg Smith, an Australian living in a town of Bluebell, a town of around about 6,000 people, essentially a suburb, I suppose, of Philadelphia on the east coast of America. Yeah, interesting to get an Australian's perspective.